Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us. Today's webinar is Understanding Children's Responses to Domestic Violence and Other Trauma, the fourth webinar of our new series, Building Trauma-Informed Services for Children, Youth, and Parents Impacted by Domestic Violence. Our trainer today will be Susan Blumenfeld, MSW, LCSW, and Child Trauma Training Director for the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Before we get started, I'll go over some of the technical details of the WebEx software that we will be using for today's webinar. Many of these details are explained in the Using this WebEx System tab on the upper left-hand side of your screen as well. Please be aware that your screen might look a little bit different depending on whether or not you're using a Mac or a PC. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are multiple boxes. The second from the top is the chat feature. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in contact with the trainers or myself if you have any questions regarding the training content. You may contact Jennifer Curley, also with the Center, if you have any questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. To do this, click the down-facing arrow and select the person you would like to contact. You will see a lot of options, but for this session, you'll want to select all participants if you'd like to respond to a question from the trainer or contact me anytime during the session. You should click on Jennifer Curley to privately contact her if you're in need of troubleshooting the WebEx software. So let's test this chat feature. Will everyone please go to the chat box, click on All Participants, and type in the program you are calling from, and then press Enter? Great. It looks like some folks are putting some info in. Excellent. Thank you so much. While folks can get a lot out of the chat feature, there are times when it moves really quickly and it can feel distracting. So if this is true for you, you can feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking the arrow next to where it says chat. You can always open it again with the same arrow if you choose. We will be providing live captioning during this webinar. Below the chat box, there is a media viewer box. This will contain the captions. If you do not want to see the captions, click on the down-facing arrow next to the word media viewer the same way you might if you want to hide the chat box. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. If you're experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact Jennifer Curley, you can call the WebEx tech support to resolve any additional issues. That phone number is 1-866-229-3239, and we'll also post this in the chat box. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will now turn the webinar over to Susan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our fourth webinar in the series, and thanks, Erin, for walking us through the features. And we're going to get started. Let's see. Okay, I'm having a little trouble. Here we go. Okay, so this just gives you information about our center, and we encourage you to check out our website and see the resources that we have and call upon any of us to help with questions or resources that might help you do your work better. So to begin today, we are going to use breath as a practice that we've used before, and we start this way not only because it's important to make that transition from whatever we were doing before the webinar started, but it can be helpful for each of us in our daily lives and in our work, and we can offer breath as a practice to the families we work with as a way of dealing with stress and helping them move towards a greater sense of balance and well-being. So right now I just invite you to shake out your arms and legs a little bit and get comfortable in your chair. And then take a deep breath in through your nose, clear down to your belly, and then blow it out through your mouth. And we're going to do this several times. So on the in-breath, you can say silently to yourself, my body is filling with calm. And then on the out-breath, I am releasing all tension and worry. Let's try that again. In-breath, my body is filling with calm. Release, I am releasing tension and worry. My body is filling with calm. and I'm releasing all tension and worry. So just as a reminder, it's always important to find your own right balance with the materials that we're going to present. We know for some folks that materials can be evocative, and so feel free to check out, doodle, do whatever you need to do as we continue on with the webinar. And remember that we're archiving this, so you can always pick back up on it at a later time. So I just wanted to remind us to begin with a bridge from the webinar that we had last month. And in that one, we spent some time talking about our earliest relationships with family and caregivers and the importance of attachment relationships in scaffolding our development and also buffering us from stressful and traumatic experiences. During that webinar, we introduced the concepts in the circle of security and the graphic that went along with it. And I know from the evaluations that a number of you really found it very useful. I was pleased to see that. And we talked in some depth about the role of parents and caregivers in creating a safe base for their children from which to learn and go out and explore the world around them, and also to be a safe haven. And that may mean for a younger child crawling into a parent's lap and getting a big hug, or being there to just sit with them when they're having really difficult feelings, big feelings, that they're feeling overwhelmed, and helping them to calm and soothe and feel better. In that webinar, we also discussed the value of applying a developmental lens and as we're thinking about our work. And we went over what kinds of tasks children typically master at different ages, and how trauma and experiencing domestic violence may interfere with how children's relationships develop, how their self-regulation and self-control develops, and their ability to learn and master tasks as they go along. Sorry, I'm having a few technical issues here. So today we're going to use the same lens to examine how our brains develop, our physiological stress response system, and how trauma might affect the development of our brains and our stress response systems over time. And we're going to look at trauma responses in children across ages and stages of development, so from birth through 18 plus. And then we're also going to look at what kinds of strategies and supports can we give children to help their healing and promote resilience. So how our brains develop really organizes, the brain helps organize our personalities, how we see ourselves, the way we relate to others, how well we can pay attention and concentrate, how we respond in a crisis, how we identify emotions, and how we think and solve problems. Our brains also control the way our bodies work, our sleep-wake cycles, our sensation of being thirsty or hungry, what we take in through our 5 senses, our digestion, our heart rate, breathing, and how we move. So some of you may be thinking, well, so why is, we're talking about children and trauma. Why is this important? Why should we know or care about this? And the reason is that this information can be useful to both children and their parents, and in our role as advocates as a key to understanding behavior and traumatic responses. So what I'd like to start with is something that Dr. Dan Siegel has put together, and some of you may already be familiar with this, and it's called The Brain in the Palm of Your Hand. So what I'd like to invite you to do now is to take one of your hands and have the palm facing you, and now bend your thumb into the center of your palm, and fold your other fingers over your thumb. So now you're holding your fist in front of you so that your fingernails are facing you. And from here, surprisingly, there is a model that we can look at that really replicates parts of our brain. So there are three major parts of the brain that we're going to be looking at. So the brain stem, the limbic regions, and the cortex. And today we're going to talk a little bit about how the major parts of the brain are separate but interrelated. So if you're looking now at your hand in front of you with your fingers over your thumb, your wrist represents your spinal cord that's coming up through your body and neck and coming up into the center of your palm, which represents the brainstem. And the brainstem's been referred to as the reptilian brain by some, and it's the oldest part of our brain, and it takes in sensations into the body and from the body, and it involves our perceptual system, and it plays a role in regulating states of arousal like wake and sleep and appetite, our heart rate, our blood pressure, our body temperature, and our activity. And now the thumb, which is in the center and enclosed by the fingers in this model, the thumb represents our limbic system. And so if you look at the picture of the brain in front of you, and I'm going to try something for me that may be a little fancy here. I'm going to try to do my arrow pointer. Let's see if I can do that. I don't think it's working for me. Okay. So the limbic system represents, if you look at the part in the center of that picture of the brain where it says amygdala and some of the areas in hippocampus and the areas in there that are labeled on the diagram. So it's a little awkward, but stay with me on this. Your thumb represents your limbic system, your emotions, our attachment relationships, our motivation to do things, and our memory. And together, the limbic system and the brain stem help regulate arousal, emotions, and our survival reflexes of fight, flight, and freeze, which we're going to talk about some more later when we look at how our bodies respond to stress and traumatic stress. And then the walnutty outer layer of the brain is the cortex, and that's where we do all of our thinking and higher reasoning, and also in the prefrontal cortex, which is if you look at your fingers facing you in that part of the brain, that's where we begin to understand how someone else might feel and what might be going on in their mind and differentiating us from them. And it helps us with attunement and all kinds of great stuff. So Dan Siegel talks about the fact that, and this is not scientific, he is a psychiatrist and a neurobiologist, but he says he refers to what he calls the upstairs brain, which is the cortex, the cerebral cortex, and the downstairs brain, which has to do with our brain stem and some parts of the limbic system. And what he talks about, which I think is really helpful, because this is a model that he demonstrates universally to parents. So it's not only parents who are experiencing trauma in their lives or with their children. But he says, you know, we've all had the experience of being really tired or under stressed or feeling overwhelmed. And so what happens then is, and you can see as we look at our hands and the fists that we've made, that the fingers that are sitting on top of our thumb help mediate our arousal levels and staying in control and being self-regulated. And when we get really stressed out, we flip our lid And so if you just raise your 4 fingers, that's what it looks like. And then we act in ways that we're not really happy about and that can be scary and frightening to others, including our children. And when we're more in control and those fingers are there and the prefrontal cortex is mediating what's going on in the downstairs part of our brains, then we are able to be tuned in and connected and more in balance. So we used to have the old nature versus nurture, and now we know it doesn't really work that way. We've got our genes that really are the blueprint for some of how our brains are wired, and we also have our innate temperament. We're not going to spend time on that today. But then we've got the environment that we're in, and that's of critical importance. Because as we think about a baby's brain developing, it starts to develop in utero, and whatever is happening in the outer environment that's affecting the mother is going to also potentially have an impact on our brains as they're developing. So if we think particularly about the impact of trauma and overwhelming stress during pregnancy, that can have an impact. The big takeaway message here, though, is that our brains develop also based on what our experiences are like, how we're responded to, what's the quality of the caregiving that we get as we're growing. And from those repeated experiences of loving care and being attended to and feeling safe and nurtured, we start to develop a mental model within our brains of what we can expect. So let's just review this, and I'll read through what's here. But in order for our brains to develop, it requires stimulation. So children that are growing up in an environment where there is a scarcity of interaction and a paucity of back and forth interactions that can be nonverbal, smiling, cooing, etc., the brain's not going to be stimulated to begin to make connections between the neurons or the brain cells in the same way. And experiences then lead to creating neural pathways or circuitry in our brains. And those that are consistently stimulated become stronger, which makes sense. And genes and experience work together. And as I said earlier, genes provide the basic wiring plan, but experience really fine-tunes how the brain is built. You also have a handout that I'm not going to go over now, but that you can refer to afterwards. That it's a 2-pager that gives you terminology on brain development and also talks about timing of different pathways that when neurons travel, where and how the brain starts to develop. And we also introduce the terms myelination and pruning, and we'll talk a little more about them as we go. So almost all of our neurons are present at birth. We still do continue to develop some new brain cells as throughout our lives, but most of them are present when we're born. And so those early experiences really impact how those neural connections and pathways are formed. And the first 3 years of life are particularly important. There's a lot of a normal process of pruning that takes place for those connections that aren't getting much stimulation or activity. And I think most of us have heard the expression, use it or lose it. And that applies here to how the growing architecture of the brain gets built. So if a child has repeated experiences that are scary and traumatic, then those fear circuits, neural pathways, get stronger. And there will be fewer and weaker connections in those parts of the brain that involve attunement, learning, self-regulation, or self-control. So that's got big implications that we're going to look at as we go along. And we now know that our brains continue to develop through adolescence and into early adulthood, into about 24, 25 years of age. And the good news in all of this is that our brains have plasticity, which means we can make new neural connections and pathways and learn new things throughout our lives. It's more difficult, however, if the architecture of our brains gets built a certain way when we're young. Adolescence becomes a time of change and remodeling. So Linda Chamberlain, who has a series that's you've got referred to called the Amazing Brain, says adolescence is a window of opportunity for developing a better, smarter, faster brain. Okay. So I want to talk next a little bit about this remodeling that's going on during adolescence, so from the period of about age 12 to 24 years. So this is a time when the prefrontal cortex, the part that mediates our emotions and our survival responses and our self-control, is really developing at a rapid pace. And this is going to help us as well in terms of our general cortex development in terms of the capacity for more abstract thought and how we can reason, and also being able to fine-tune our empathy and ability to take the perspective of another and to regulate emotions. So Daniel Siegel came out with a book last year in 2013 called Brainstorm, The Power and Purpose of the Teenage Brain, and you do have this reference at the end of the slide set. And he debunks some myths that we have about teenagers, and we can understand it then from a neurobiological perspective. So we're looking at that period between 12 and 24 years. So it really goes beyond, we're not fully developed in terms of our brains when we're still in our teens. So it moves beyond our teens. It's another period of pruning, so we're getting rid of those connections that are no longer needed so that we can have a more efficient, faster brain. And the myelination process, which coats these pathways, helps speed the connections, and there's a growing complexity to the neural pathways that we're developing. So here's what he debunks. He said, we think about adolescence as a time of immaturity. And he says, that Siegel says it's really a necessary process of transformation of the brain. So I think it's not something that we're just trying to get through, live through, but actually the brain's plasticity is a really important gift for adolescents and for all of us then, in terms of it becomes a time for them to really cultivate their passion and interest and get really good at something that they love, because it's through those repeated practice and just as the experiences when we were young really developed neural pathways, we've got the ability then to hone our talents and abilities as adolescents. And so, for example, playing soccer or playing a musical instrument, getting involved with the sciences or the arts. So it's kind of a broad range. So it's necessary. It's not just something to live through. And he also debunks the myth about raging hormones and that explains teens' behavior. And he says, really, yes, there are hormonal changes at puberty, but the brain's going through a process of remodeling, and teenagers and adolescents are more sensitive to emotions and stress as part of this remodeling process. So it's not only thinking about hormones. So he says at that period of time, the reward centers of our brains are much bigger. So there's more dopamine that's getting generated in our bodies, a neurotransmitter. And with that, adolescents seek out novelty. And so they're focused on the exciting parts of what they're doing, and unfortunately, they're less aware of the risks. But as he explains, this novelty seeking is really a necessary developmental phase to get adolescents ready to leave home, to leave the nest, to leave what's familiar or comfortable, and hopefully what's been safe. So that risk-taking is actually, it seems like it's neurobiologically driven to help all of us with that transition. And I think, as we know developmentally, that adolescents seek out their peers. They're trying to separate from and push away from their parents. And at the same time, they still need adults to help provide some kind of counterbalance to what may be less than stellar judgment when it comes to something that they think might be rewarding, that has to do with risk-taking. So I think all of this is a helpful backdrop, not only for thinking developmentally about teenagers, but then thinking about how is this going to affect teenagers who have experienced a lot of trauma in their lives. So next, I'd like to talk about trauma memory and brain development, because I think there's some important concepts here that are helpful for us to understand trauma responses in children and also in adults. So we have two kinds of memory, implicit and explicit memory. And when we talked last time about the circle of security and the ways in which we learn of what's okay to do and not do, and how we take cues from our parents, either going, or our caregivers, going on the top of the circle to explore or coming in, and what our parents are able to attend to in terms of our needs, we take that all in an implicit way, and it gets encoded. And it's not implicit memory is not something that we're conscious of, and so it starts at an early, really early age. It begins at birth, and so these are nonverbal memories when we talk about implicit memories. And so when we're talking later about trauma reminders, it's important to remember that implicit memories are not conscious. We just have a response. And from that, Bowlby talked about the fact that we create in our minds these internal working models for how we see ourselves and others, and then that influences our perceptions and how we respond to the world around us. Explicit memories don't begin until about the end of the first year of life. We start to get factual memory around 18 months, and then our autobiographical memory, which places us within those memories, ourselves within that, starts after our second year of life. And the hippocampus that we saw in that picture of the brain, which stores, it stores explicit memories, and it's not fully developed until a child is 3. So as we think again about trauma and when it occurs and development, it's important to kind of keep in mind how the brain's developing at the same time. And in order to have explicit memory, we have to have some development of our prefrontal cortex that I talked about, the very front, those front knuckles of the fingers that we did in our hand model of the brain. And with that maturation, we begin to have a sense of our self-awareness, holding another in mind, regulating our emotions, and all of those functions are shaped by our attachment relationships. So you start to see how the things that we've been talking about fit together. And So why is it important then, or why is it helpful sometimes to translate implicit memories into explicit narratives? Why does that help promote healing? And part of the answer to that is that because implicit memories are more sense memories and they just come up and there's no consciousness attached to it, it's not labeled in time at all. And so when children are having, and adults are having trauma reminders, it is cut off from the actual experience itself and can be very frightening. And when we're able to bring those memories into explicit memory or a narrative, then we begin to have a better sense of what's happening right now and what happened in the past. Before we leave this topic, I also wanted to say that young children have been known to play out scenarios from traumatic events that occurred before they had language and before their capacity for explicit memory was fully developed. So I think this is really significant for us, and because it answers the question, well, our little kids, before they've got any real memory of this that they can talk about, are they really affected by trauma? And the answer is yes, they are, and that it lives in the body and in implicit memories. But if we can bring it forward through talking and play and other means, we can help promote healing. Okay. So next we're going to look at, and this is totally interrelated, how stress and traumatic stress affects our development. So we looked at this particular slide last week, and this comes from the Center on the Developing Child. And I'll just say again, for those of you who may not have had a chance to either listen to that webinar or attend, that we've made some change to how the folks at the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard look at this. We don't use the term that they use, which is toxic stress. We use the term traumatic stress instead. And the reason why we use that is that we feel to talk about a caregiving environment and people creating stress that's toxic becomes dehumanizing to the caregivers and is not particularly helpful for us when we're working with families. So these are the children have and are exposed to a continuum of stressful experiences, and here we have the slide again. Some of them are positive, and they help us again to sort of mediate stress in our lives and to keep things under control and to learn from positive stress and to feel good about ourselves. Including traumatic stress, all of these can be buffered and mediated by our attachment relationships. And so I think that's the important takeaway that I wanted us to consider for this particular slide. Okay, so our stress responses are survival responses, the fight, flight, or freeze response that we've heard of. And what's important about this piece is that it's an automatic reflex response, and it helps us to survive dangerous and life-threatening situations. And it's really mediated by the reptilian part of our brains that we talked about, by the brainstem. So we don't think something's life-threatening, my life is in danger. Our bodies respond. So what happens within our bodies? And if we look at this chart, we can see that there's all kinds of stuff going on. So the brain gets us ready to have one of these reflexes. The body releases adrenaline and other things that are helpful for us to survive. Our blood pressure goes up, our muscles get tense, and our heart pumps faster. So what happens when our physiological stress response system is activated is that it shifts priorities in the body because it gets us ready to flee, to fight, or to freeze until the danger passes. And it puts those higher parts of the brain and functioning and development on hold. So learning, future-oriented responses, planning, we're just in the moment. And everything within our bodies and minds are helping us to survive. So we're focused on vigilance, focused attention, increased muscle tone, and heart rate. Okay, so I think what's really important here is that children do experience all kinds of stress in their lives, but with a little bit of comforting, soothing, and help from a parent or caregiver, if it's a positive stress or even if it's one that's more of a tolerable stress, kids can move back where their physiological system goes back to a resting baseline and they don't have that adrenaline pumping and their heart racing and their blood pressure going. And then this helps regulate stress hormone production during the early years of life, and that's really critical, and we'll see in terms of what happens if our stress response system is continually on high alert, and because we've got prolonged experiences with traumatic stress. So we're back to looking at our model of the brain and what happens, and if the fear circuits are turned on all the time, the amygdala, that little part in this picture, which is, just got a beep, I'm not sure what's going on. Okay. Sorry. Bessel van der Kolk, who's done a lot of really important work around trauma, talks about the amygdala as the body's alarm system. So again, this isn't something that we give a lot of thought to. This happens automatically, but we're on high alert. And so what happens for children that have prolonged stress exposure is that the body starts producing cascades of stress hormones such as cortisol that flood into our bodies. And then what we find, if children don't have buffering relationships available to them in the moment, and they have these repeated experiences, that it can actually impact our health and well-being, and our immune system is affected. And I think we may have spoken in the first webinar about the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and that's a large retrospective health study that showed that stressful experiences, repeated experiences in childhood can affect our health and well-being. So that's one of the consequences of this. And in addition to that, as we've been talking about, it actually affects how the architecture of the child's brain develops. And as a result, because of what happens in terms of being repeatedly exposed to traumatic stress, is that it can lead to difficulties in that higher cortical functioning in our brains, learning, being able to concentrate, memory development, and self-regulation and self-control. So before we leave this topic of the brain and stress development, I really wanted to emphasize two key takeaway messages. And the first one is the critical importance of early intervention. So when we understand that there's some urgency, then we can get that information to parents, and we can help and support them to find ways to begin to buffer their children's experiences and attend to them in ways that are going to help calm their stress response system and help them make different and more adaptive neural connections. And we do throughout the United States have early intervention services that are available for children from birth to through age 3, up to age 3. And so I just wanted to put in a pitch for everyone to kind of check that out in your area if you're running a program, because we do know that children that have experienced trauma tend to have more delays, and this is now not surprising from the information we just got, but more delays in language, speech, communication, because again, the brain has different priorities that is then affecting unfolding development. And then the last takeaway message, because this can be very difficult, I think, to take in and to realize that this is happening for children, but that we do have plasticity within our brains and that we have the capacity to change throughout our lives. So it's never too late. And truly, adolescence becomes a time for remodeling and rebuilding the brain. And so it's another opportunity. Okay, so I'd like to pause at this point and just ask you to reflect a little bit on what we've been talking about. And if anyone has any questions at this point, we'll take a moment before we go on. I'm looking to see in the chat, and Jen, I'm not sure if there's anything there for me yet. Well, why don't we just take a deep breath, because that's a lot to take in, I think. Okay, no questions yet. And Rebecca says, and I wholeheartedly agree, that it's the positive message around that there is hope and it's never too late that we want to convey to the families that we're working with. Absolutely. And certainly when we're going to be spending some more time in future webinars talking about how to engage with parents around insensitive conversations. And so I think that this becomes a time when we can think about, if we want to give information to parents and hope that they will intervene earlier and take advantage of access to services, we also want to present that information in a way that doesn't lead to a parent feeling overwhelmed with self-blame and guilt. Let's see. Okay, so there's one other question, and I'll take that, and then we're going to move on. It says, what is one way to turn implicit memories into explicit memories? So that's a wonderful question. And of course, that's different for each person. What I've experienced as a mental health clinician working with children and families is that sometimes children will start to play out and use a metaphor of play, possibly with animals or little figures, something that's happened in their lives that is related to implicit memories, but they're not aware of it. And so by working that through in the play and then talking about and empathically responding to the little animal that's scared, or finding a different scenario and moving towards a sense of safety, all of that can help children to begin to have a narrative about what happened. And once children have language, then they can begin to put those together so that things are anchored in time. And so when we're doing therapy with children that's trauma specific, we'll start to give them cues to help them remember something that happened and bring it more into explicit memory, like, was it snowing outside? What was happening when it was snowing? Or what were you wearing? Or what was Grandma cooking at that time? So I think that's a short answer to what you were asking. Okay. So as I said in the beginning, we're interested in all of this because knowing how our brain develops and what happens to our stress response system and how that can be altered by trauma really gives us a beautiful key into understanding children's behavior and trauma-related responses. So that's the next section that we're going to cover today. So we're going to identify some of these, look at what we might see across developmental ages and stages, and how we can support parents and caregivers to help children heal from the effects of trauma. So because we're layering in different topics throughout this 10-part webinar series, I wanted to review something that we covered in an earlier webinar, and I'll review it fairly quickly, but just more to bring it to mind again, that we know that each child is going to respond in a way that is unique and different to them. And it depends on all those factors that we looked at when we're looking at our model of impact. So what all the protective factors are, what the risk factors are, what supports they have internally and in their family and broader system. And then also it makes a difference as to how old the child is and what their developmental capacities are, which may vary depending on the child. And then we know that protective relationships and other supports become key in helping children to heal and to become more resilient. And then the fourth point of review is that children can experience what's called post-traumatic stress symptoms, or something akin to post-traumatic stress disorder like adults. And this is also a slide from a previous webinar where these are the different categories of post-traumatic stress symptoms or within post-traumatic stress disorder. This was revised over a year ago with the latest clinician mental health manual. And what we're going to see from these four categories is that children's trauma-related responses may fit in to one of these. And we'll see how that works. You also have either the link to or the handout with this webinar on tips for supporting children and youth exposed to domestic violence, what you might see and what you can do. And this is from our website. And it's something for you to read. You don't need to get it out now unless you have it right in front of you. But we're going to kind of walk through this a little bit and talk in some depth about what we might see and then what we can do. So for very young children, up through age, the preschool years, up through age 3, in general, they're going to have a somewhat different they will have different trauma-related responses in part than older children and adolescents. And so one of the things that we might see is that kids develop new generalized fears. So all of a sudden they're afraid of dogs and they weren't before. Or they're afraid of the water, or they don't want to eat certain foods. They have an aversion to it. So we see this happening quite typically with young children that have trauma experiences. And then kids may become more aggressive. And really, the way I understand that is that young children have less sophisticated coping mechanisms, and they may have lots of stuff going on in their body, and it's almost like the aggressive piece is a motor discharge. And it also may be acting out things that they have seen with adults that have been frightening. In addition, we find that young children may lose their recent developmental achievements. So they go back and they regress to an earlier phase. So kids that were talking in full sentences are doing more baby talk now. Or they just started walking and they go back to crawling. They were toilet trained through the night and now they're not. So those are just some examples with young kids. and what we might see. And again, the most important thing that we've talked about anytime we look at behavior in children or responses, we have to understand it in the context of what their experiences are, because we may see all of these things and they may not be related to trauma. So that's a really important caveat that we always have to keep in mind. So here are some of the things that we're going to see with babies, with toddlers and preschoolers. So we talked about how when our stress response system gets altered that we're on high alert. And so the very first piece here about children being easily startled is related to that. So they're going to have almost like a startle reflex. We typically see sleep disturbances, nightmares, sometimes night waking without memory. And again, sleep is a time when kids have to let go. And if stuff happening while they're awake is very frightening to them, it's scary to make that transition into sleep. And if they're having bad dreams, they may not want to go to sleep either. We also see with young kids, so they're at that point where they should be going out on the top of the circle and exploring their worlds and feeling great, but they're not feeling secure, so they may become more clingy and really have trouble separating from a caregiver or the primary protective parent. We also see shifts in mood, and so that was one of the, if you recall, one of the PTSD categories. So you see kids who seem like their mood is very blah, and they don't have much joy and they don't have much ups and downs. And if they had started doing play and exploring, that all gets inhibited. You also see a lot of irritability in toddlers and preschoolers, and these intractable temper tantrums where they just fall apart. And again, if we think about what we just learned about the brain and how when our stress response system gets altered, it really takes less stress for us to fall apart and for us to flip our lids in the terms of Daniel Siegel. And then there's that sense of scanning for danger and expecting danger and being on high alert. And again, we see the last dot point on here with older children as well. But if they have trauma reminders, they're going to get very distressed and or try to avoid whatever it is that reminds them of what happened that was frightening. So let's talk for a minute excuse me, about trauma reminders and what they are. So this ties in with what we talked about a little while ago about implicit memory. So they're internal reminders. They can be body sensations, they can be feelings, and they're not necessarily conscious. So we don't feel pain, let's say, in our stomachs or our heads and think, oh, I'm feeling this because it's related to something else that happened that was very frightening or overwhelming for me. And trauma reminders can also come up. I think we talked a couple times ago, or I think in the last webinar, about how parents and children, the protective parent and child, may become trauma reminders for each other. The parent sees her child crying, and it reminds her of seeing her child crying and feeling helpless when she was getting assaulted. So, but it can be a range of things. If domestic violence typically happens within the home. And so everything in the home that was there or that the child looked at or was thinking about or whatever when a traumatic episode was happening can become an external reminder in the future. And as we had the discussion about how it's helpful to be able to organize and put these things into explicit memory, is that it really does help us begin to say, oh, what I'm feeling right now, I'm safe right now. I'm in the present. I'm here. I'm in this. My mother's right here. She's got her arms around me. I'm okay. I'm safe now. I'm not in the past. And so part of what's really helpful is helping both parents and children to become more aware and to look for cues about what might be going on when children are having trauma reminders, so that they can understand this and feel less helpless and vulnerable. So an example might be, I'll give you a few examples. So a child's watching something on television that's violent. There's fighting going on. That can be a trauma reminder. Or we've got kids increasingly playing very violent media games. I do want to put in a pitch that for kids in general and kids that have experienced lots of trauma, that parents should protect them from these kinds of media, because it really exacerbates their reminders of trauma, and it's not healthy. A child who's seen blood and injury may see, for instance, strawberry Kool-Aid spilling off the, in their cup onto the table, and that's a trauma reminder. Or an example of a child where the Child Protective Services worker came to the house and is wearing a green coat and is taking the child and removing them from the home. And the child sees a green coat on another adult that's walking towards him or her and starts to cry and fall apart. Another example that I like to share sometimes is with a 3-year-old that I met who was staying with her family in a domestic violence shelter. And an older boy in the shelter was helping with an activity of putting up some artwork that they had done on a bulletin board, and a staff member had given him a staple gun to use to put the pictures up. And after he finished doing that very handily, he then took the staple gun and was pretending that he was stapling his arm. And at that moment, this 3-year-old started trembling, and she fell to the floor and was crying. And when we later talked with her about it and reassured her that she was okay, we put together the fact that she was remembering the incident that had brought them to shelter, in which her mother had been punched in the arm repeatedly by her father. So those are examples of trauma reminders, and they can play out differently depending on what the child's developmental age is, or stage. So with younger children, we're going to see more tantrums, or the trembling that I was talking about, or freezing, or crying, or hiding. So they don't, if I don't see it, then it's not happening, or screaming. For school-age children, we're going to see more somatic type responses, where they have typically headaches or stomach aches or other kinds of, they're taking a test and they start to feel anxious, and then it becomes a reminder of how they felt when something scary was happening at home. For adolescents, we talked earlier about the fact that things are shifting, and so they're going to feel their emotions more exquisitely. But as the prefrontal cortex is developing, they don't always have the kind of control over their emotions that they're going to have as they get older and the brain matures. So when they start to have strong feelings and reactions to trauma reminders, it is very embarrassing and uncomfortable, and they start to feel like I'm not normal, and they're going to do whatever they can to try to avoid the trauma reminders. And that might be numbing out, and that might be doing a variety of different things. And we know that because of the dopamine that gets released in the brains of adolescents, that they're going to be more susceptible at this point to using alcohol and drugs, because it sets off the pleasure center. And so combined with how they're trying to cope with their trauma reminders or experiences, kids are more at risk then at that age for using substances. Often, particularly with really young children, we don't always know why they're having the experiences that they're having. But when we see kids falling apart in the ways that they might be, from what I just described, and we don't know what it's about, it's important then for us to think, okay, there may not be a one-to-one correlation, or I may not really understand what might be going on right now, but maybe it is related to a traumatic experience that this child has, and that they've got some kind of reminder. And I think if we can keep that in mind, then it really helps us to be more empathic as parents, caregivers, and as advocates working with families. Okay, so now we're going to think about and look at, and some of these are covered in your the handout, the tip sheet that I talked about earlier. But what kinds of things can we do to help young children re-regulate, soothe, calm, so that we can calm down that altered stress response system? And one of the things that I think is really important is that even young kids that don't necessarily understand everything that we might be telling them are going to pick up on the nonverbal cues of the tone of our voice, how we're looking, how we're expressing ourselves, the intensity. And so when we talk about things with children, we can then, in a sense, help them to re-regulate and co-regulate them by how we're responding to them. And when we're calm, then we can help them become calmer. It's also important for kids to know what's going to happen next, because trauma feels so unpredictable when it's happening. It does feel like it comes out of nowhere, and it's overwhelming. And so often children that have experienced repeated traumatic experiences really need to know, and it helps anchor them to know what's going to happen next, what's coming next. And so along with that, having predictable structure, daily routines, transitions, help with transitions, so before and after meals, doing homework, getting ready for bed, all of those times are really critical to helping reestablish a sense of safety and security for children. And I know from the work that I've done and from talking with and consulting with parents and advocates and mental health clinicians that for many of the families, before they come to services, things have been very, very chaotic in their homes. And perhaps some of the parents grew up as well in environments that were not predictable. And so some of this then is giving information to parents and caregivers about how this is going to help kids to become more resilient and to heal. And I think sometimes when that's presented and as an option, parents are receptive and responsive, but it may take a while because it's difficult for any of us to change what comes naturally to us. The other piece is giving choices, and the more choices the better, because again, that really helps children have a sense of, I'm in control of this. I can wear my green shirt or I can wear the one with the stripes today, that kind of thing. And we spent some time in the last webinar talking about providing, excuse me. Some other devices are going off. I apologize. So we talked last time when we were looking at the circle of security about how parents can provide reassurance and a safe haven for children. And that may be a lap, that may be talking to them in a way that's soothing and calming, but also being with them and helping them to identify big feelings that they might have, and not trying to jump to what they should do to feel better or to try to take care of it, but to just be with them and help them to calm down and to know that they're not alone and that you're with them. So children from a very early age on really blame themselves and feel responsible for scary things when they happen. And some of that's self-protective, because if they take in the fact that it's not their fault, then it means that the people that they're relying on aren't reliable. And that's a little hard to take in. So the flip of that, though, as we're trying to look at how we can help kids to heal, is having the protective parent or caregivers provide that reassurance saying, it's not your fault, you didn't make this happen, no matter what the abusive partner may have said in that moment, it wasn't because you spilled your milk. That's not why this happened, etc. And of course, as kids get older, they think about all the ways in which they should have known and stopped what happened. So it's so important for children to be reassured that they're not responsible for what happened, and it's not their responsibility to take care of the violence that occurred, and that their protective parent is doing whatever he or she can to help them feel safe again and to reestablish that protective shield. So with school-age children, we're going to see some of the same things that we did see with younger children, but we're also going to see a few other things. And one of the pieces here is post-traumatic play. So this is a term that is used by mental health clinicians, and when we talk about play, we have to think about play as a developmental achievement. And play in general really allows children to master their feelings and master the world around them. When children engage, and not all children do this, but when they engage in a particular kind of play called post-traumatic play, it really has the opposite effect. They're doing a kind of reenactment of a part of something that happened that was particularly terrifying or scary. And it's got this kind of unremitting, relentless kind of pace to it. And children can become dissociated while they're in the midst of that play, and or more anxious. And it doesn't lead to mastery. It's just kind of like, in a sense, it's like replaying those neural circuits that might have gotten formed from the traumatic events themselves. And post-traumatic play is different from the kind of play that you're going to see in children who don't quite still have the capacity yet to symbolize their experiences through play. So post-traumatic play is really playing out and reenacting a part of a scene in this kind of chilling detail. And it's different than seeing a kid that takes two cars and is banging them together. And so some of that's motoric discharge, and some of that may be some fragmented, almost like implicit memory about fighting and violence that they've seen. So it's an important distinction. And hopefully this will be helpful to you as you're thinking about children that you work with and that you see. Okay, so we talked about physical symptoms that come up for school-age kids, and then more concerns about their own safety and the safety of others. We talked about feeling more guilty and responsible and the antidote to that. And then again, difficulties with learning and concentration. A lot of their energy may be focused on re-experiencing aspects of what happened, feeling scared, having trauma reminders that really take away from the ability to be in school and attend and learn and concentrate. And then as they get older, having revenge fantasies about getting even and protecting the parent who has been hurt. So again, it's helpful with school-age children to be able to talk about what's going to come next or happen next. Again, it gives predictability, structure, and a sense of being more in control. So those first 3 dot points are very similar to what we talked about with younger children. And then as children get older, they're going to have a bigger capacity to identify and express feelings through play, talk, or the creative arts. And this becomes a way, again, to move implicit memories into an explicit type narrative, building on that question that was asked earlier. And then it's really important if parents, caregivers, and advocates are able to encourage children to speak to what their concerns are, and then to answer their questions truthfully and simply. So if we can provide reassurance to do that, but not to promise or state things that we know we're not in control of, but not to give too much detail either, because children can get flooded by if they listen to adults talk about their experiences of what happened that was frightening for them as adults as well. So, okay, so what we're going to see in adolescence, and I think I talked earlier about this in terms of that self-consciousness. Adolescence is a time of self-consciousness, but about their fears and having these intense feelings and just desperately wanting to be in control of that and not to have those feelings. Who would want them, right? And so this is a time where, as a part of normal development, adolescents are going to do more risk-taking and sensation-seeking. For adolescents that have experienced trauma, there's more risk there in terms of risk-taking that might be more life-threatening. It may be true typically for adolescents, but even more so because there's more of a desire to numb out from difficult feelings. And again, all that prefrontal cortex of the brain isn't fully developed yet, and they're going to feel things more intensely because they're adolescents. And so it's harder to mediate the different, that upstairs and downstairs brain. Also, this is a time where we're going to see that unfortunately adolescents that have experienced repeated trauma may engage in behaviors that are self-endangering, such as cutting. And they may start detaching from others as opposed to going to peers or having trusted adults that can help them kind of find their way. They may not be able to do that. And we may also see then that adolescents are making an early exit from home, or they have trouble with leaving, because again, you have to have some sense of a secure base to feel like you can move out and be more independent. And if a lot of your concern and worry is about the parent who's a protective parent who's in danger, then you're much more conflicted, obviously, about separating from that parent. So again, I think the ways in which we can support adolescence flows fairly logically from what we were talking about, that even though they may not show us directly and it is important for them to have peer contact, that sometimes it's helpful to adolescents to be able to stay close when they've experienced trauma, and to be open to listening to them and responding, which does not mean that parents don't have the difficult task of setting limits, but really being able to hear what the teens have to say and to respond to their questions honestly, even if the ways in which things are said may feel attacking to the parent or caregiver. And again, because adolescence is such an exciting time in terms of self-expression, that there are all kinds of ways in which, safe ways in which they can begin to express their feelings through journaling, poems, art, other activities. And it's a time, again, because the brain's remodeling to really encourage those interests and activities, so that not only helps promote their self-confidence and mastery, but it's at a time of life where if they start to practice these skills, they're going to have this as they get older. and it's one of those real sensitive periods in the brain that we can help adolescents take advantage of. And again, to give choices, but also to set limits, because without any limits, it's really, the world's kind of a scary place. So the next thing that I'd like to do is talk to you about an activity that we've used in our trainings and that advocates have tried in shelter programs and community-based centers, and have really enjoyed this as an activity that they can do with families. You do have a link to a resource that's called Resources for Grounding, Emotional Regulation, and Relaxation for Children and Their Parents. And what I'm going to talk to you about is called Bedtime Beads, and you can look at that, and I'm just going to read to you a little bit from this script to give you an idea of what this is about. So we talked earlier about the fact that many children have difficulties making transitions. And sometimes it's separating from a parent to go to school, separating from the protective parent to go visit the non-custodial parent. And sometimes it's making that transit from being awake to being asleep. So what you want to do is to get some sturdy string, small beads, and then larger beads. So in this picture, we've got, it's just kind of some representation, but you have small beads, and then you have larger beads that can get some paints and markers and stickers that children can decorate. And this is something that we recommend anywhere from age 3 to teenagers, 16 or so. And it's an activity that incorporates relaxation skills for self-regulation. So the beads can incorporate deep breathing skills that hopefully you have taught to parents and parents have taught to their children. So if you get small beads, and let's say they're all like a neutral brown color, represent the breath beads. And so each time you come to a smaller bead, you take a deep breath. Then the larger beads are going to be individually decorated and will represent positive self-affirmations, images, memories. So it can be anything from, and it can also be things like words or such as love or hope or happiness, or pictures of like a basketball, if the child's a basketball player, or a picture of a cat or a beach, or it's kind of an endless sort of thing. But the idea behind this is that the parent or activity leader and the child talk about what images the child wants to select. And so if it's a younger child that may not have defined motor skills, they can select stickers, and so they can put stickers on the larger beads. But they're going to talk about what's important about it. So it's a way to also, if you're doing this with parents and children, it's a great way for them to get closer and to communicate about what's positive in their lives. So once this is completed, it's really an object that the child can take with them anywhere. They can put it in their book bag if they want to on their way to school, and they can have it with them at bedtime. And it can become incorporated into a bedtime ritual. So, because bedtime is often a time where images and things that are getting re-experienced around the traumatic experiences start to intrude. It's nighttime, and nighttime may have been a scary time. So this is a way of really counterbalancing that by giving the child or adolescent something that they can focus their mind on, along with the deep breathing that should help them relax as they're making a transition. So that's bedtime beads, and I hope some of you that are doing are involved in doing programs will consider trying this if you haven't already. Let us know. Okay, so how can we support children's healing across ages and stages? So this is more of a summary. And I want to tie in the first dot point of acknowledging feelings. For so many families, a way of coping and surviving has been to just keep going, and we don't talk about anything, because if we do talk about things, things could be worse. So in the process of healing and recovery, when families are safe, there's a whole process of beginning to identify feelings and the expression of feelings in a safe way. And if we think about this from what we talked about earlier with our limbic system in the brain, that this is an area where, along with the prefrontal cortex, we start to mediate what those emotions are and feelings in a way that gives us more control. And Daniel Siegel also says about feelings, what's shareable is bearable. So when we can talk about it, and that can help us then bring it into awareness in a way that makes it more bearable and manageable. So the second part is really, and we talked about this earlier, responding to concerns and worries in a developmentally sensitive way. So using explanations and tuning into where the child is at a level that makes sense for them developmentally. And again, I think a part of this is being able to connect first with the child's own experiences. So parents have to have enough equanimity themselves when something's going on for the child and they're experiencing worries or distress to be able to separate themselves from the child, hold the child's feelings in their own minds, and then be able to be soothing and calming and be with them and not to jump to problem solving. And what Siegel talks about, he's got another one of these snappy phrases called name it to tame it. And what he's talking about there is that once we can connect with and be with children and their feelings, it's that bottom half of the circle that we talked about last time, that we can say things like, you were really scared when that happened, or I bet that made you feel bad for that kid to talk to you that way, or not to be able to, the kids turned away from you when you wanted to play with them, etc. And once that gets named and children are at a point where they're calmed enough, then another part of the brain helps calm down that activated stress response system, and the child's feelings get tamed. But it's a process. And I think, again, we've talked a lot about understanding these responses within the context of development and also the child's experiences. So we might see a lot of responses that are not related, so we just really have to get them in context and understand that. And then the piece of offering, and we talked about specific ways of offering safety, structure, and support, and building those or rebuilding those attachment relationships with parents and with other caring adults. So at this point, I'm going to pause for a minute and see if there's some other reflections or questions that people have. Okay, and Jen's just given me a few questions. The first one is from Cassandra. She writes, I see a lot of cases where children's services so that would be Child Protective Services, is going after victimized parents for failure to protect as they become more aware of this kind of impact of trauma exposure on children and what the effects are. That's a great question. And so we're really careful when we think about and talk about this to differentiate the role of the protective parent who is not responsible for the violence that is happening to them and that pattern of violence. And if they could control their partner, then they would be able to protect their children differently, but they can't. So I think that the more information that we have about this and the more that we can differentiate what role the abusive partner has in creating an environment of fear within the family system, the more we can separate out the two. And currently, even though I know that people still think and use that phrase, failure to protect, but to my knowledge, throughout child protective service systems in the United States, that is no longer a reason to remove a child from a home with a protective parent. There have to be other risk factors going on. So thank you, Cassandra, for that question. The next question is from Lasanja. Let's see, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If I'm not, I apologize. Okay, this is a big question. How can we help parents with children dealing with trauma and help their children, especially if the parents are dealing with their own trauma? So, excellent question. And a piece of the answer to this is that just as children cannot calm down and we can't help them organize their feelings on the bottom of the circle if we can't connect with them around what they're experiencing first and be with them around that, then we can't bring in all that left brain stuff that's more problem solving and trying new things, etc. And the same is true for parents. So I think that the more we can recognize the ways in which trauma has impacted the protective parent, the more then we're able to acknowledge that, validate what's going on with them, connect with them, and give them some strategies for coping differently when they have their own trauma reminders, and also giving them some latitude about this is so difficult because we know how much you love your child and how distressing it is to see your child having these kinds of responses. But we also know that you have another challenge, which is managing and coping with your own responses. So I think that's the beginning for us in terms of it's a process. And if parents aren't at a point where they themselves can get the support and reflect on what's going on for them, it's very, very difficult to attend to their children's needs. And as we move on in the webinar series, we're going to talk more explicitly about ways in which we can connect with parents and help to support them so that they can support their children. So I thank you for that question. So I'm going to run quickly through some resources that you may want to check out, and that I think if you want to read more about brain development and the impact of trauma, here are some great resources. We don't have the capacity at this point on our webinar series to show you clips, so we invite you to go and watch these video clips about how the architecture of the brain gets built. And then I just wanted to make you aware of some great parent and caregiver resources that speak to this subject. So the next in our series, coming up in October, we're going to look at how we're offering DV services within our domestic violence programs. And we know that our services are critically important in terms of helping families move towards safety and well-being. But often these services are geared towards either supporting adult survivors, they're segmented, or addressing the needs of children and teens. And so thinking in the next webinar, thinking across roles within programs, we're going to provide some very practical information for how we can bridge this divide. You could be an adult advocate, or you could be a children's advocate, but there are ways in which within our roles we can enhance supports to adult survivors who are parenting and create more family-centered services. So I hope you can join us for that. And now I will turn this over to Erin to conclude our webinar.
Excellent. Thanks so much. I would like to thank Susan Blumenfeld for such an exceptional webinar today. Thank you to Caption Colorado for providing today's captioning, and thank you to Jen Curley for making the webinar run smoothly. Last but not least, thank you all so much for spending your time with the center today. Within the next week, I will send you all a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's webinar, in addition to the slides and handouts that Susan referenced, all of which will be available on our website. You'll also receive a certificate of attendance for your time today. At the end of the webinar, when you close out, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. If you could please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better, it would be really helpful. Thank you so much. Thanks again, and we hope you all have a great afternoon. Take care.